storytelling, when you have NPCs in the group, it's another avenue to have that storytelling.
Hi, welcome to How to D&D. My name is Fred Wheeler, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. But today, actually, I'm not going to do most of the talking. I have D&D Homebrew, or Kevin from D&D Homebrew, and he's going to actually discuss the topic for today, which is non-player character party members. Hi, Kevin.
Hi. How's it going, Fred?
It's going pretty well. The topic, I believe, that we started talking about is you wanted to talk about non-player characters that actually travel with the party and sort of adventure with them and some of the issues around that topic, correct?
Yes.
I understand that there are essentially a bunch of rules that give you very light sort of coverage with regard to companions in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is on page, 92 and 94, right through from 92 to 94. And then there's also sidekick rules from Unearthed Arcana, and there's in the Dungeons and Dragons Essentials kit, they actually have sidekicks in a little bit of detail there. And I believe Tasha's Cauldron of Everything is supposed to have more sidekick rules, which sort of talks about NPCs that are roughly the same power level as the player characters rather than lower level than them.
Well, which would be great, because that leads right into what I think about in terms of hirelings or NPCs. I think of them as characters on equal footing with the players. That's, whether they're a third level or fifth level, because oftentimes you're taking hirelings because, kind of the first category I always think of is to fill in holes that you have. If you don't have a fighter in the party, if you don't have enough players, you've got 3 players in your campaign or 4 maybe even, but you want to have more to fill out the ranks, right? Because when you're out there in the world or in a dungeon, you've got ranks, you're in a position. And if you don't have enough characters, you can have your vulnerable spellcaster be encountered or be something come up from behind. So to me, the NPC, when you hire them to fill out, it's just a standard thing I've done since I started playing D&D, right? We would find someone, and instead of the sort of hireling person for a few silver or whatever, I always thought of the story behind it, because first of all, it's a storytelling game and you want to have a story. And these hirelings are, they're like the mercenary in an old spaghetti Western type thing, or in, Star Wars thing, whatever you want to think, a fantasy film, a guy hanging around the tavern who's interested in finding a party. He's a capable fighter, a cleric, spellcaster, whatever. He sees this group and he wants to join up, but he's joining as an equal. He's joining as someone who's part of the party. He's not some hireling, some flunky. He's a guy that has his, or girl or whatever, that has his own story, that has his own goals and motivations. And what I found over the years, I used to have these hirelings. I had one, and I think I mentioned it in my video. His name was Holden. He was a fighter. He ran with a group of mine for like 2 years. He rose up from first level to like 8th or 9th. And he became a living person to this group. And when he got killed, they did everything they could to try to bring back Holden. They went on an actual kind of crazy mission, death-defying, for an imaginary character, right? Because Holden had become part of the party. So I think, and I developed personality, and I went into his family, as he stuck around and they kept him along, I developed this whole storyline with him, and it was all imaginary, right? It's the power of D&D. It doesn't just have to be the players. So to me, that makes it more interesting, hirelings, because let's face it, you do sometimes have to fill out the party. So that's kind of how I think about them in a basic sense. You have a hole in your party, you then fill them in, and then you think about what can I make that's unusual? Yes, you can just have a standard fighter with a high strength, high con, pick a way that, a martial thing or eldritch or whatever you want to do. But what is there that can be more interesting about that? And so you think about, for example, race and character combinations that might be unusual. I mean, we've all seen, almost as a gag, the halfling barbarian kind of thing, but there can be other ones, tiefling druid or something that maybe the characters wouldn't take. You can also have a hireling who is unusual in they have a certain amount of knowledge or something that from their family or whatever that relates to the adventure, but it isn't necessarily relevant to their class. So you could have a fighter whose family lore has information that the players could use, or just that he keeps to himself. But later on, when they're confronted with something, he says, my family, blah, blah, blah. And that gives him something different than the usual hireling.
So I guess you're talking about filling in a gap in the party. And I agree. I think that if you have a small group in particular, and when I say small group, I'm thinking a small group could be 1 player, 2 players, 3 players. And in some cases, you're right. Sometimes some adventures require more than 4 players to actually get through, because the nature of, 1 or 2 individuals go down, and it becomes much harder for those who are still standing to get the others up or secure them in a safe way and continue engaging with the enemy if there's still a fight going on, which there probably is, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of other types of NPCs that would travel with a party. And what would they be, Kevin?
An NPC with a story, right? An NPC who the players meet, and they've got some very specific story that they have and that they want the players to either help them with, or the players become involved with them. For instance, years ago, I had this storyline that I actually took from a movie. Akira Kurosawa had this movie called The Hidden Fortress about this princess who was going to be forced into a marriage. It was an evil thing. And she had this samurai warrior that went with her, and they escaped. So I had the players come across these two, and they told her their tale, and they fought off these guys, and they decided to take her to this other city in this fortress, her true love kind of thing. And again, it was a little hokey. We were young, but still, it was. And then, as they went through this thing, she had these divination powers, and it became obvious that she wasn't just some, dumb princess or whatever. And this was why the evil characters wanted her so bad, because she could divine the future. She had these powers. And the samurai rarely said anything. The players for a long time thought he was mute, right? But in fact, then he made these sort of droll witticisms later on once he respected the players, because he had a very strict code. He was sort of not a paladin per se, but he had been entrusted by his king with the princess's life, and he was going to do whatever it took. That's an NPC that comes along, and he provided help. He was a deadly fighter, right? So he provided real value to the party, but it was a storyline that they slowly discovered more and more things. And with her divination, she began to tell them things about their futures and their quest, because she would have these visions. She would go into this trance, and so I managed to also take that storyline and expand it into the players in other directions.
I believe we had a discussion, and you said there was actually a third type of NPC that travels with the party. You've covered the one that's story related, and you've covered the one that fills in the missing piece within the party. Mm-hmm. But there is a third one that you thought you wanted to discuss, right?
Yeah, and that's the unusual NPC. And this is in regards to an NPC who has some capability that the players wouldn't do, right? The players wouldn't necessarily create this kind of a character, right? So let's say you have a high intelligence character whose family is a family of musicians. They're bards. His father's a bard, his mother's a bard, and then they have this kid who has an 18 intelligence. Well, if a human person, a player had a character with an 18 intelligence, they're going to be a spellcaster. They're not necessarily going to be a bard. So to me, though, what if you had a bard with an 18 intelligence? And not only that, but they were super interested in arcana and history, right? So they are this bard character with this intelligence, maybe add on a little multi-class, right? Or, some kind of, maybe another thing, although as a bard, they have the spell casting. But it's something that the players, and they have this ability. So when they go places, this person is super versed in knowledge of the world, in arcana. So it's a totally unusual character. Or maybe you have a fighter who, through his family, his father or mother was an alchemist, and they have alchemy ability. They can gather things to make potions, herbs, whatever. So they have a utility that is unusual and that can be used by the players. And it isn't just a plug-in fighter that, just stands in the front ranks and wields damage. The unusual NPCs can also be very useful for the players to learn things about running character classes, running things that they wouldn't run, how a character class can be done in a novel way. Because what happens, I think, we all think of min-maxing, right? We all think about, you wouldn't do that, and you would never have a character with that, right? When in fact, D&D is about storytelling. It's about taking things as they come. The bard was going to be in the family business, and he had an 18 intelligence, but he's going to be in the family business, and he lives with that, just like in the real world. You know, in the old days when we just rolled 3 dice, we just took what we had. So you had a character, maybe we would throw out 3s and 4s, but you had 5s, right? You had a character. And what happened was sometimes those characters became the most beloved characters because I'm dealing with my guy with the 5 wisdom or the 5 strength, you know, or the 5 charisma, right? Everyone dislikes me. And you think, oh, it's going to be the worst character. But in some ways, it teaches you so much about the game. So to me, the unusual NPC, and I guess we can get in now to whether the players run it or the GM runs it or what the balance is, because the unusual NPCs give the players a chance to run characters that they would never think of.
So basically, when we're talking about non-player characters traveling with the party, we're not necessarily talking about the dungeon master running that non-player character. If anything, it's actually another character in itself. They are essentially running another character, second character.
Well, okay, and this is really good because if it depends, right? Because if they go to the town and they want a fighter, I'm going to give them the fighter's stats, and I'm going to let them run the fighter up to the point of the fighter goes into the cave and sees what's there. And then I say, no, you go into the cave. You're not going to send the NPC, right, to do something that, because then I just have the NPC go, I'm not going in that cave. Are you kidding me? So I let them run it. I show them the stats and whatever. But for instance, the princess, I'm going to let them run her a little bit, but I'm not going to let them know necessarily that she has divination powers, that she has secrets, that she has some amulet of protection until that NPC trusts them enough to tell them, right? So I like to let the players run it and maneuver them around until and once the players get to know, okay, I can't just send the NPC into the cave. They'll run them competently. They'll just run them like a fellow person they would run. They're worried about their safety and everything. Then when you reveal the secrets and whatever, then you allow them to utilize that, right? But it takes trust. You know, this NPC is a person, is a real sentient being with issues of trust. Who are these people? He has to see how these guys operate in the world, right? How do they handle captured enemies, or do they just slaughter all that they see, or what is their ethos? We haven't even talked about. We could talk about NPCs which hide secrets of being evil. Now, I wouldn't necessarily do that because it can be a little unfair. So only when you have a storyline where the characters meet someone and they all escape from a castle dungeon or something, and this guy's with them, and then maybe the person is a little more nefarious. But the point is, they have to discover: can I trust these guys, or are these guys good and I'm not so good? And maybe I shouldn't be running with them. You always are thinking of how they would react as a real person. There's a classic thing of an actor, I think it's like Lee Marvin or something, and they said, how do you play villains? You're really good at villains. And he goes, well, because I don't play them like villains. I play him like a guy who everything he does for a reason. He's justified in everything he does. He grew up in a tough environment. He had people beat on him, so he beats on people, whatever. He's a good guy. He's not a villain. So the NPC, he's always thinking, I'm right. I'm the good person. And the players have to earn his or her trust, right? So I let them run because I think it's funner to just have this party and, unless they just absolutely don't want to, especially if you have like a spellcaster or something, sometimes they don't want to do that. But if they're good enough players, they can handle it. And then you reveal any secrets or whatever as it's appropriate.
So I think my experience with running non-player characters in a party has been, I find that it can be quite complicated. You've already got a lot of pieces moving around as a dungeon master. So it's not necessarily something you want to jump at, particularly if you're new. If you're experienced, even experienced dungeon masters forget stuff, particularly when they're running a whole bunch of monsters and they've got an NPC that casts spells. I noticed that when I was running Esmeralda from the Curse of Strahd. I've noticed that with a lot of other characters that I've had to run over the years, and it's very easy to make mistakes. What I have found is if you've got somebody who's very strong at the game, they've been playing for a while and they're quite competent, then getting them to run that NPC, they are usually the go-to, the one you want to sort of pick out. It's funny how they tend to be the power gamers and the min-maxers and the rules lawyers. And if you give them two characters, there's a lot less damage they can do to the table if damage is actually going to occur if they are having to manage two characters at the same time.
That is a great point. And I'm thinking back and I'm realizing you are exactly right, because I had one of my best friends that I played D&D with from when I was 13 years old or whatever. Great player, really nice guy, but a rules lawyer. I mean, he just knew everything. And if he was occupied like that, he was not disrupting my campaign. He always supported me. He was always like, I want to run in Kevin's world. We love his world, whatever. But I knew I was going to have a battle, right? Because he knew every monster. And then I would change the monsters and he would say, what is this? And I'd be like, who knows, right? Because why should they just, there's a manual? Is there a manual on people? Every person has to be this. I don't think so, right? So you're right. I would let him run the and he liked it because his mind as a scientist, worked for the Jet Propulsion Lab, and he could juggle an entire party, right? He was that smart. So you're right though. When he was running that, he was less problematic. And you don't want to give a new player a spellcaster, because not only, like you're saying, they don't know the rules, they're going to feel pressure. You forget about when you first started, how you felt insecure, right? About what do I do? It's my turn. What do I do? And everyone's looking at you, because if you can't say anything, you got to, what are you doing? And the new players, there's pressure there. And so giving them an NPC just adds to that, right? If it's just a fighter, although again, I say just a fighter, I'm always going to have a little bit of a twist to them, right? Yeah, you let the experienced players run the NPCs.
Now, the other thing that we discussed was that there can be problems with running a low-level follower or NPC in a party. It's not so much of a big issue at low level when they're playing at like level 1, 2, or 3, even maybe 4 or 5, although I feel with Dungeons & Dragons 5e, level 5 is like a big, huge power boost, and it changes the game completely, and people don't realize that sometimes. Absolutely. But at much higher levels, having a low-level follower just presents a target for a dungeon master, because for me, if there's an NPC in the game, I don't know how you feel about it, but if there's an NPC in the game and there's a player character and I have a choice between targeting an NPC who's in the front line or close to the front line, I'm going to do that, because that's not actually the player's character. So if they perish, it's not a big deal as far as I'm concerned, because I've done the thing that is less likely to cause drama at the table rather than targeting and taking down a player character. And I think a lot of players think that they've got a dungeon master who's actually being ruthless towards them and being unfair. And actually what they're doing is they're deciding, okay, which one is likely to cause the least amount of trouble for the players in terms of how they will feel if things go bad. You're not planning to do it, but that's one of the things I think you were discussing, was that it's not really appropriate to have low-level torchbearers and horse squires and so forth traveling with a very high-level party.
Well, and yes, and let me say first, and we discussed this before, I thought your video on that was great, because I thought torchbearers, what a great artisans. There were all sorts of NPCs. You think of like a guide. When people used to go into the Himalayas, they didn't just go, let's go. They got guides, right? They got experts, Sherpas that took them up the mountain. So there would be these low-level characters. But of course, guides and mountaineers all have the same number of hit points, right? Whereas if you're 5th and up or whatever, and you're starting to run into monsters appropriate to your level, the torchbearer, the dragon flies in and blasts everyone. He's just an ash, right? Think of the guys that used to sit around the dock and try to get on ships to unload ships or just sail or whatever. They're not going to sign up to a mission when they see these really deadly guys. Yes, we're going into the haunted tombs. Who wants to be the torchbearer? I just feel like it's not realistic to have them at that level. And yet maybe you could have some kind of protection thing or something for them. I don't know. But to me, and you're exactly right too on picking on the NPCs. Of course we do that, right? You want to show this creature has lightning breath. Who does he hit? He hits a red shirt, right? The old Star Trek trope. And then Kirk goes, oh, he's got lightning breath. So you do that with the NPCs. And sometimes, this makes you not want to, I'm going to develop this super elaborate NPC and work on him, and then he's going to get killed. Well, first of all, he might not get killed. Second of all, and I don't know about you, I like thinking up characters. I like looking through their stats. Yes, I don't have time to do it a lot.
So there are some optional or variant rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide around loyalty for your non-player characters or companions. And I have never actually used the loyalty rules because I felt like it wasn't necessary. I would use just a narrative. If the players are nice to the NPC, then the NPC will be nice to them. If they're not very nice to the NPC, then maybe the NPC will decide that they don't want to be around them anymore and they will leave, or they will reciprocate that animosity. Have you had any experience around the loyalty rules?
Well, in fact, way back when they had the hirelings in the first set of books and everything, and some of the other things, we used to talk about, well, what, my charisma, I'm going to get these guys all whipped into, I'm going to get them going. In terms of looking at the things in the Dungeon Master Guide, I haven't used those because I just use exactly what you're talking about. Storytelling, when you have NPCs in the group, it's another avenue to have that storytelling.